St. Paul, Minnesota, summer 1990. The hour was just past 3 a.m., and the city lay deep in its slumber, blanketed by the heavy silence of Midwestern night. Somewhere behind a row of aging houses on the east side, an alley flickered to life, not with neon or car lights, but with flames. A local homeowner, unable to sleep, caught sight of the glow. Moments earlier, he'd heard the crunch of tires on gravel. A vehicle entering the narrow lane behind his home. Then silence, and then fire. He stepped outside. A large object was ablaze, the heat casting eerie shadows against the wooden fences. It wasn't trash. It wasn't tires. And it wasn't an accident. He called 911. By the time St. Paul Fire arrived, the blaze had eaten through whatever it touched, but not enough to mask the truth. Wrapped in what was once a plastic tarp, now melted into a molten shroud, was a human body, charred, anonymous, and dumped like yesterday's sins. When homicide detectives stepped into the scene, they already knew this wasn't some random street killing. This was execution, calculated, cold, covered in gasoline and silence. The body was scorched beyond recognition, yet the autopsy would speak louder than the fire ever could. Beneath the soot and burned tissue, the coroner found the truth carved into bone. Multiple gunshot wounds to the skull, fired point-blank. A firearm with small-caliber rounds. Efficient, quiet, and unmistakably personal. And yet, no ID. No wallet. No name. Whoever dumped the body made sure there would be no easy answers. But in the age of fingerprints in federal databases, anonymity has its limits. Back at the morgue, technicians worked past midnight, dusting blackened fingers with as much care as they give a living hand. What little was left, they scanned into AFIS, the Automated Fingerprint Identification System, a massive, ever-growing federal network of over 20 million criminal records. They waited, because this wasn't just a local matter. The brutality, the method, the absence of identification, it all hinted at something darker, something bigger than St. Paul. A ghost from out of town, perhaps a message left in fire. While the prints processed, detectives turned to the only clue they could trust. The method. Victim shot execution style, doused and burned. No shell casings. No sign of a struggle. Clean. Too clean. To seasoned eyes, this wasn't personal rage. It was professional fear. The St. Paul police suspected this was drug-related. And for good reason. You see, in the summer of 1990, Minnesota, with its quaint suburbs and quiet streets, had become a quiet favor for cocaine traffickers looking to expand operations without the blood-soaked spotlight of Miami or L.A. And with that cocaine came dealers, enforcers, muscle, and murder. But in every tale of shadows, there's one light that never wavers, the FBI. And on this case, they were already watching the borders, watching the planes, watching the mules. At the Minneapolis St. Paul International Airport, agents from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, working in close partnership with the FBI, ran quiet interdiction drills, eyes on travelers arriving from drugstore cities like Los Angeles and Miami. It was routine most of the time, but that day, routine broke. At a Northwest Airlines ticket counter, two men approached, calm, confident, but maybe too much of both. They were paying in cash, thick rolls of it, for 2 one-way tickets back to Los Angeles. That alone wasn't illegal, but it was enough to make the agents look twice. The names they gave were Jeffrey English and Harry Babs. To the trained eyes of narcotics investigators, they weren't just flying home. They were fleeing something. The men were tracked to their gate and approached by officers who identified themselves as federal agents. They asked polite questions. The men gave polite lies. They said they were just visiting an old friend, someone named Ken Jones, and were now heading home. The agents asked if they'd mind their bags being searched. The men nodded. Consent was granted. That was their mistake. In one of the duffel bags, tucked deep beneath clothes and toiletries, lay a thick plastic bag filled with over $13,000 in rubber-banded cash. Dirty money, maybe, but not yet enough to arrest them. But in the lining of a shoe, something else waited. A .22 caliber Derringer pistol, small enough to disappear in the palm of a hand. Concealable, deadly, silent, and that changed everything. Neither weapon nor currency had been declared. That gave the agents probable cause. The men were arrested and removed from the flight before wheels up. Nothing dramatic. No scuffle. Just a quiet boarding call they would never answer. Back at the station, Jeffrey English would finally admit his name wasn't English at all. It was Jeffrey Barnes. And he didn't explain why he lied, only that he had his reasons. He claimed the cash came from selling a car. The gun? He said he bought it off the street. Didn't know where it had been. It was a strange thing to say. The kind of thing you say when you know exactly where it's been and what it's done. The fingerprints came back on a humid Tuesday morning, inside a windowless office buried deep in the St. Paul Police Department. A technician squinted at the computer screen. The system had found a match. Name, Duon Walker. Age, 26. Residence, Compton, California. Criminal record, narcotics distribution, multiple priors. The man in the fire wasn't just anybody. He was a known player in Los Angeles' cocaine corridors. Someone who knew the game and knew the risks. But still, even for that world, this kind of send-off was excessive. The feds took notice immediately. A known California dealer found dead, execution style, in a Minnesota alley. And just days before, 2 men from L.A. caught at the airport with cash, weapons, and a fake identity. This wasn't coincidence. It was a fuse, and it had just been lit. The call came from Los Angeles. Duon Walker's uncle, having seen a brief news article about an unidentified body found in Minnesota, phoned detectives in St. Paul. He said his nephew had flown there a week prior to meet someone named Ken Jones and hadn't been heard from since. That name again. Ken Jones. If you've been working narcotics in the Twin Cities, you knew the name like a shadow in the hallway. Jones was more than a drug dealer. He was a supplier, the top of the pyramid, the man whose hands never touched the bricks, but whose profits built entire neighborhoods. Publicly, Jones was the image of urban success, running legitimate businesses, donating to youth programs, smiling for cameras in city council meetings. But on the streets, he was something else entirely, and people were afraid of him. By now, the pieces were aligning but still scattered. The FBI, in tandem with St. Paul investigators, began peeling the onion. They checked airline manifests, traced phone records, interviewed employees at Jones's known businesses. But it was like questioning ghosts. No one had seen Duon. No one remembered a visit. No one had heard a thing. No one talked. Jones was too big, too careful, too dangerous. Even if Walker had met him, even if the two had done business, there was nothing, not a receipt, not a phone call, not a witness, that proved they'd ever been in the same room. And Jones? He said nothing. Didn't have to, without the murder weapon, without a cooperating witness, without DNA or blood at the crime scene. The case was already beginning to cool. Minnesota detectives had seen it before. The perfect murder, wrapped in silence and fire. But what Jones hadn't counted on was time, and the persistence of the Bureau. Then, 3 months after the murder, something broke. A routine traffic stop. Random. Unplanned. The driver, a wiry man with a nervous smile and an L.A. driver's license, was arrested on a warrant tied to narcotics trafficking. His name, Charles Shuck. To the untrained eye, just another courier. But in the world of federal interdiction, Shuck had a history, one that caught the FBI's attention. Months prior, agents had watched him fly into Minnesota on a last-minute ticket. Light on luggage when he arrived, heavy when he left. They'd pulled his bags. One was empty. The other, packed with 2 kilos of uncut cocaine. Shuck had vanished before they could pin him with distribution. But now he was back in custody and willing to talk. With the weight of federal drug charges staring him down, Shuck played his only card, a name, Ken Jones. Yes, he worked for him. Yes, he carried coke across state lines. Yes, he'd been paid $1,000 a trip. He'd moved weight for years. No, he'd never asked questions. That was part of the deal. But what he said next changed everything. He knew about the body in the alley. He knew about Duon Walker. And he knew who pulled the trigger. The man behind the gun? Jeffrey Barnes, the same man caught at the airport, flying under a fake name, carrying a .22 Derringer and a bag of dirty cash. The same gun that, according to Shuck, had been used to shoot Walker 3 times in the skull, execution style, inside the bathroom of Jones's private condo. Walker, Shuck claimed, had somehow crossed a line. Maybe he owed. Maybe he talked. Maybe Jones just didn't trust him anymore. Whatever the reason, the order was given. Barnes did the deed, cold and clean, and the next day tried to vanish. It wasn't just hearsay. Shuck said Jones's own girlfriend had confessed to cleaning the bathroom afterward. She had been in tears. There was blood, a lot of it, pooled by the tub, streaked along the tile. She hadn't asked questions. She knew better. Jones had ordered the place scrubbed, and she obeyed. The details were too precise, too raw, too intimate to be fabrication. Suddenly, everything changed. But for federal prosecutors, suspicion wasn't enough. They needed the gun. They needed proof. And they needed it to hold up in court. That little Derringer, tucked in a shoe at the airport, might just be the key to it all. In the world of murder, the weapon is a ghost. It vanishes first, long before the sirens arrive. But in this case, the ghost had been caught early, quietly resting in the lining of a shoe inside a duffel bag, carried by a man with a false name and a flat alibi. Now it was time to ask that ghost to speak. The .22 caliber Derringer, no bigger than a clenched fist, was handed over to the St. Paul Ballistics Lab. They needed to see if it could be tied to the bullets pulled from Duon Walker's scorched skull. But it wasn't that simple. The barrel was short, only an inch long. That meant it lacked the length needed to leave deep rifling impressions on the bullets, the kind analysts rely on to make a match. The result came back, inconclusive. A dead end? Maybe. But the FBI doesn't walk away from murder with a shrug. Instead, they ship the weapon to the alcohol, tobacco, and firearms forensic lab in Washington, D.C., where technology runs deeper and patience is part of the process. This time, the specialists went microscopic. They traced every groove, every irregularity, and compared them to the damaged slugs extracted during the autopsy. And after days of examination, the answer finally came. It was a murder weapon. The same gun Barnes had carried. The same gun Duon Walker never saw coming. That tiny Derringer, tucked into a shoe on its way back to L.A., had once whispered death in a Minnesota bathroom. And now, it was ready to speak in court. The FBI had their weapon. They had a witness. And they had the beginnings of a case. But they still didn't have blood, or DNA, or any trace of the crime scene. So they tried the obvious move. Search Ken Jones's condo, the place Shuck said Walker had died. But the judge, sharp and skeptical, refused to sign the warrant. There wasn't enough, not yet, to invade the home of a respected businessman, even if his reputation in the street told a different story. Still, the Bureau wasn't done. They played the long game. They needed someone closer, someone inside. Then came a glimmer. A former flight attendant, now involved with Jones, had long been suspected of helping him traffic narcotics. Her name wasn't mentioned often, too risky, but she was known to those close to the operation as his eyes in the sky. She had moved more than just carry-ons over the years, often acting as a courier, flying with hidden kilos on red-eye flights between coasts. She played her role well. No arrests, no trails. But the murder, that was something different. According to Shuck, after Duon was killed, she'd been ordered to clean up the mess, told to scrub blood from the tiles, erase every drop. It wasn't part of the game she signed up for, and that the agents believed made her vulnerable. But reaching her, getting her to talk, that would take time. Fear ran deep, and loyalty even deeper. With the physical case stalled, the FBI began to build the web. They sifted through years of phone records, financial transactions, and travel logs. They studied Jones's network, his businesses, his enforcers, his couriers. Every move, every call, every dollar was traced. And slowly, a pattern emerged. Ken Jones wasn't just a drug dealer. He was running a structured narcotics enterprise. Coke in, money out. Couriers paid in silence. soldiers like Barnes on call for enforcement, and Jones himself untouched. Until now, because even the most careful empire leaves cracks, and the Bureau knew exactly where to press. While the analysts traced the paper trail, the agents turned back to Shuck. He'd given them Barnes. He'd named Jones. He'd connected the gun. But it still wasn't enough. They needed something bigger, something they could put in front of a jury. So they asked, where did Barnes go after the killing? Shuck shrugged, said Barnes took his payment, around $13,000 in cash, and vanished. But he remembered something else. Barnes hadn't wanted to carry the gun anymore. It made him nervous. Paranoid, he was supposed to dump it. Instead, he flew with it and got caught. Now, the case was no longer theory. The FBI had tied the murder weapon to the killer. They'd tied the killer to the money. And the money to Ken Jones. It was a house of cards. And one strong breath would bring it down. All they needed now was to find the second witness. The woman with the bleach and the blood on her hands. The one who cleaned up the bathroom. And maybe, just maybe, had finally had enough. Inside the Bureau's field office in Minneapolis, the whiteboards were no longer blank. They were layered in lines, connecting faces, phone numbers, airports, aliases, shell businesses. A constellation of crime orbiting one sun. Ken Jones. He was still walking free, still playing the community leader, still signing checks, smiling for cameras, hosting charity events like he didn't have blood under his fingernails. But the walls were closing in, and he could feel it. Meanwhile, the FBI had their eyes on Jeffrey Barnes, the alleged triggerman, and they weren't alone. Street whispers had started to circulate. Barnes had pulled the trigger. Barnes had flown out too fast. Barnes had brought too much heat. And in Ken Jones's world, heat was a death sentence. If Barnes had spoken to anyone, if he was even thinking about it, he wouldn't live long enough to take the stand. The Bureau knew they were racing the clock. So they moved quietly. They tracked Barnes across California, mapping his movements, listening to his calls. He didn't talk about the murder, not directly, but his silence said enough. The .22 Derringer that once spoke for him was already in custody. Forensic proof of his guilt. The question now wasn't if Barnes had done it. It was who gave the order, and who was finally ready to say it out loud. Back in St. Paul, the FBI turned their focus to the one person they believed could shatter the case wide open. Jones's girlfriend, the flight attendant turned courier, the woman who once flew with kilos of cocaine wrapped inside luggage tags and carried cash like it was shampoo. The woman who, according to Charles Shuck, had broken down in tears after scrubbing Duon Walker's blood off a tile floor. They approached her gently, carefully. This wasn't a street bust. This was chess. At first, she denied everything. She claimed her relationship with Jones was romantic, not professional. Said she'd never been involved in drug activity, never seen violence, never carried a single illegal ounce. But her hands trembled, and her story didn't hold. Because the Bureau already had flight records. They had financial transfers. They knew what days she was on duty, and what days kilos crossed state lines. They had timelines that matched her itineraries with Jones's profits. They confronted her with it. And then came the question that ended her silence. Did anyone else know you bought the gun? Her eyes shifted. There was a pause, just long enough for fear to slide in, and then she spoke. Yes, she said. Tom did. Tom, her name for Ken Jones. It was the crack the Bureau needed. She admitted that Jones had asked her by the .22 Derringer, the same one Barnes later carried, the same one that killed Duon Walker. She said Jones told her it was for protection. She didn't ask questions. She bought it, gave it to him, and that was that, except it wasn't, because now, under federal law, she had transferred a firearm to a known felon for the purpose of committing a crime. She was on the hook, unless she helped. Her attorney stepped in. A deal was arranged. Immunity in exchange for cooperation. And finally, the dam broke. She confirmed that Jones had orchestrated every piece of the crime, that Barnes was his enforcer, his blade in the dark, that the gun she purchased had passed from her hands to his, under Jones's orders, and that after the murder, she was ordered to clean the scene. She remembered the blood, the smell, the silence in Jones's eyes. She'd tried to forget. Now, she never would. With both Charles Shuck and Jones's girlfriend now corroborating each other's stories, and the murder weapon confirmed by ballistics, the case was no longer circumstantial. It was a fuse lit at both ends. The FBI, alongside federal prosecutors, began drafting charges. But before they made the arrest, they needed to make sure Jones didn't vanish. Because men like him, with that much money, that many connections, and that much to lose, don't wait around for the knock on the door. They run, or they kill. So the FBI watched. Surveillance teams were placed on Jones 24 hours a day, rotating agents in unmarked vans, watching his businesses, watching his condo, watching people who watched him. The air around him was thick. And for the first time, Ken Jones started to sweat. But he didn't know how close it really was. Behind those silent eyes, the Bureau was building the final blow. And soon, the empire he built from cocaine, charm, and control would come crashing down. It was a bitter morning in November 1991, when agents from a Federal Bureau of Investigation, backed by local authorities, received the green light they'd waited over a year to hear. Proceed with the arrests. There would be no spotlight, no press conference, just steel handcuffs, quiet steps, and the kind of silence that meant everything was finally going right. By sunrise, 3 doors would be kicked in. 3 men, ghosts until now, would find themselves face to face with the very system they thought they were smarter than. Jeffrey Barnes was the first. He never saw it coming. They took him without resistance. No bullets, no chase. Just a slow, silent surrender. Maybe he knew it was over. Maybe he had nothing left to say. They brought him in under federal murder charges, weapon violations, and conspiracy to commit homicide across state lines. Then came Ken Jones. The man who once played philanthropist by day and puppeteer by night was sitting in his luxury condo, sipping coffee and reading the paper, when the Bureau knocked on the door and stepped into his world. He looked up, tired maybe, or just calculating. "What's this about?" he asked. They told him, and this time he didn't smile. At the same time, agents intercepted Charles Shuck, not as a suspect, but now as a federal witness under protection. His statement, long recorded, was the spine of the prosecution. So was Jones's girlfriend, the once loyal courier who now wore a wire and walked through fire to tell the truth. Together, they formed the 2 blades of scissor. And Ken Jones? He was caught in the middle. But even with the arrest secured, the Bureau knew the battle was just beginning. Because in court, stories mean nothing without evidence. So they brought in the gun, the bullets, the witness statements, the phone logs, the records of travel, the financial trails, and, most importantly, the recovered cooler. Yes, a cooler. You see, Shuck had mentioned that after Duon Walker was executed in Jones's condo, they needed a way to dispose of the body. Jones didn't want to dig a grave, didn't want a public dump site. Instead, he purchased a large plastic cooler, the kind fishermen use for deep-sea hauls. Only this haul wasn't fish. It was a man, a dead man, folded and stuffed inside, then loaded into back of a vehicle under cover of night. That cooler, Jones believed, had been destroyed, burned, lost at sea. But the world doesn't always cooperate, because months after the murder, off the coast of Delaware, a fisherman hauling lobster traps noticed something floating in the water. A cooler, missing its lid, bullet holes in the side, bloodstains inside. He kept it, thought it was strange, then read about the Jones case in a magazine. He called the authorities. Agents traced the serial number. It matched the one Jones purchased days before Walker's death. And now, it sat in an evidence room, a plastic coffin that refused to stay buried. By the time trial began in 1993, the prosecution walked in ready. Their opening line? This case involves a man who believed he could get away with murder because no one would dare challenge him. And then they introduced the cast. A hitman with a fake name and a silenced pistol. A courier who saw too much. A flight attendant who'd cleaned up the blood, then found the courage to tell someone. And finally, a federal task force that pulled it all together, piece by piece, inch by inch, over months of silent pursuit. The courtroom was electric. Prosecutors played wiretaps, presented flight logs, introduced a gun, the cooler, the ballistic reports, and finally, the witnesses. Charles Schuck was first. He testified for hours. Calm, precise, cold, he described the network, the drugs, the murder, the aftermath, how Jones had orchestrated everything, paid Barnes to kill, and made him an accessory after the fact. Then came Jones's girlfriend. Her voice cracked on the stand. She recounted how Jones had ordered her to clean the bathroom, how he'd spoken about the body, casually, as if he'd stepped on a spider, not taken a life. The jury listened. They took notes, and they stared at Ken Jones, the man who once played the public, now reduced to a quiet defendant in a tailored suit that no longer held any power. Jones's defense? That the witnesses were liars, that the gun didn't prove who pulled the trigger, that the girlfriend was confused, that the cooler was coincidental. But the jury wasn't buying it. They could see the truth, and they could see who was finally pulling the strings. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had made the case airtight. No body? Didn't matter. No crime scene? They rebuilt it from fragments. No confession? They didn't need one. They had forensics, timelines, motive, and most importantly, witnesses who survived long enough to talk. And in 1994, after years of shadow work, the verdict came down. Ken Jones, guilty of murder in the first degree. Jeffrey Barnes, guilty as a triggerman, both sentenced to life without parole. The empire was no more. The Kingpin had fallen. And the Bureau? They didn't celebrate. They just closed the file, marked it, resolved, and moved on to the next shadow. The trial was over. The gavel had struck. And in the still air of that St. Paul courtroom, the echoes of Duon Walker's final moments finally had a voice and a verdict. No longer just a body in an alley. No longer a ghost with no name. He was a man, and now he had justice. The streets that once whispered about Ken Jones, the phantom king of Minnesota's drug trade, now spoke of his fall. He was no longer untouchable, no longer feared. Just another number in the federal system, tucked away behind concrete and steel. A name scrawled on an inmate manifest, forgotten by the city he once controlled. Jeffrey Barnes, the man with the pistol, now spent his days pacing a cell, the weight of 3 bullets forever tied to his name. He had played the role of executioner, efficient, silent, and loyal, until loyalty turned into life without sunlight. And Charles Schuck? He vanished into witness protection, traded one life for another, his past wiped clean, his name gone from every registry. But inside, he'd never outrun what he saw, or what he helped make disappear. Then there was her, the courier who once cleaned blood with bleach and silence. She turned her guilt into testimony, and her testimony into freedom. But she'd never be free from a memory of what she scrubbed away. Some stains don't lift. And through it all, the FBI remained a constant. Unseen, methodical, like the tick of a watch in a quiet room. It was their agents who pieced together the case. Their forensic labs that gave the bullets a voice. Their surveillance teams that tracked every step. Their interviews, their pressure, their strategy. The linchpin of it all. In a city where fear had once bought silence, the Bureau brought consequence. They turned whispers into warrants, lies into leverage, and shadows into courtrooms. They didn't need headlines. They didn't want glory. They just did what they always do. Follow the evidence, wherever it leads, even if that means chasing a ghost across state lines through fire, silence, and time. Now, years later, the streets are quieter. The businesses once run by Jones have new names. The people who feared him now walk a little taller. And the alley where Duon Walker was left to burn? It's just another shortcut behind a row of homes, forgotten by most. But somewhere, deep in a drawer in a federal office, there's a case file marked Walker, Duon, homicide, closed. And at the bottom, a signature. FBI, special agent in charge. Because when no one else could, when no one else dared, they stepped into the dark and brought the truth back into the light.